What would you do if your mother disguised herself as a homeless beggar just to find you a wife? Sounds impossible, right? But in a small American town, one mother's desperate love led her to the streets, wrapped in rags, begging strangers for scraps, all because her son had given up on love. What she discovered out there would change everything. And the woman who passed her test had no idea she was being watched. They walked past her like she was invisible. Some crossed the street to avoid her. Others tossed loose change without even looking at her face. But the elderly woman sitting on that cold sidewalk corner wasn't who anyone thought she was. Her name was Margaret Ruth Thompson, and just 3 blocks away, she owned one of the most beautiful homes in Riverside, a quiet town in upstate New York. She had raised her son alone after her husband died, when the boy was only 7 years old. Now, 32 years later, that son, David, had shut his heart completely. He worked, came home, ate dinner in silence, and refused every attempt Margaret made to talk about his future. No dating, no relationships, no hope. 3 years earlier, David had fallen deeply in love with a woman named Jessica. They dated for 2 years, talked about marriage, about children, about growing old together. Then one afternoon, Jessica sat across from him at their favorite coffee shop and said the words that shattered him. "I'm sorry, David. I need someone who can give me more. Someone with a bigger future. Someone who can provide the life I want." She married a corporate executive 6 months later. David never recovered. So Margaret did something no one expected. She became a beggar. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, you might be wondering, why would a perfectly healthy, financially stable woman in her 60s pretend to be homeless? What could possibly drive someone to do that? Margaret had heard her son say something one quiet evening when he thought she wasn't listening. He was on the phone with his childhood friend, Marcus. "I'll tell you what, Marcus. If I ever marry, she has to love me even if I have nothing. Not my job, not my house, not my name. Just me. If she can't love me when I'm broken, I don't want her when I'm whole." Those words haunted Margaret for weeks. How could she find a woman like that? How could she test someone's heart without them knowing? Then the idea came to her, risky and almost ridiculous. She would go to the places where young women from town passed by every day, and she would sit there disguised as someone who had lost everything, and she would watch. She would watch how they treated a woman they believed had no value, no status, no power to give them anything in return. On a cold Tuesday morning in late October, Margaret left her house before sunrise. She wore an old coat she'd found at a thrift store, torn at the sleeves and stained across the front. She wrapped a faded scarf around her head and smudged dirt on her face. She carried a chipped ceramic bowl and sat down on the corner of 5th and Main, right outside the bakery where people lined up every morning for fresh coffee and pastries. The first person who passed her was a young man in a business suit. He glanced at her, frowned, and kept walking. The second was a woman pushing a stroller. She pulled her child closer and crossed to the other side of the street. A teenager dropped $1 in her bowl without looking at her face. An older man muttered something under his breath and hurried past. For 3 hours, Margaret sat there. Dozens of people walked by. Some ignored her. Some gave money but never made eye contact. One woman actually told her to get a job. Margaret's heart sank. Was this really what the world had become? By noon, she was exhausted, cold, and starting to doubt her plan. Maybe kindness was too rare. Maybe she was asking for something impossible. Then she heard a voice. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you okay?" Margaret looked up and saw a young woman kneeling beside her. She had dark brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the uniform of the bakery, flour dusted on her apron. Her name tag read Emily. Emily's eyes were soft, concerned, and she wasn't looking at Margaret the way others had. She was looking at her like she mattered. "Have you eaten today?" Emily asked. Margaret shook her head slowly, staying in character. Emily stood up and disappeared into the bakery. A few minutes later, she returned with a paper bag. Inside was a warm sandwich, a bottle of water, and a blueberry muffin. "I made the sandwich myself," Emily said with a small smile. "I hope you like turkey." She sat down on the curb beside Margaret, not caring that her uniform might get dirty. "My shift ends in an hour," she continued. "If you're still here, I'll bring you something hot to drink. It's supposed to get colder tonight." Margaret's throat tightened. She whispered a thank you, and Emily squeezed her hand gently before heading back inside. That small gesture, that moment of human connection, stirred something deep in Margaret's chest. But she needed to be sure. One act of kindness wasn't enough. She needed to see if this was who Emily truly was, or if it was just a good day. So Margaret returned the next day, and the next, and the day after that. Each time, Emily came out during her break. She brought food, sometimes a coat, once even a pair of gloves. She never asked for anything. She never preached. She just sat and talked, asking Margaret about her life, listening as if the answers mattered. But Margaret was cautious. She'd seen people perform kindness when it was convenient, only to turn cruel when it cost them something. So she decided to test Emily in a different way. One afternoon, as Emily was walking home from work, Margaret, still in her beggar disguise, approached her on the street. She pretended to stumble, falling to the ground as if dizzy and weak. People walked past. A man glanced over, but kept moving. A woman pulled out her phone, but didn't stop. Then Emily ran over. She dropped her bag, knelt down, and cradled Margaret's head. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Are you okay?" She called out for help, her voice shaking. When no one stopped, Emily pulled out her own phone and called 911. While waiting, she took off her jacket and wrapped it around Margaret's shoulders. "You're going to be okay," Emily whispered, her hand gently rubbing Margaret's arm. "I'm not leaving you." Moments later, Margaret slowly opened her eyes and pretended to recover. She told Emily she was just hungry and tired. Emily insisted on walking her to a nearby shelter, refusing to leave until she knew Margaret was safe. That was the moment Margaret knew. This wasn't performance. This wasn't pity. This was real. But there was one more thing Margaret needed to understand. Why? Why would a young woman with her own struggles, her own bills, her own life, give so much to a stranger? So one evening, as Emily sat beside her on the curb, Margaret asked her directly, "Why do you keep coming back?" Emily looked down at her hands, quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, and her voice carried a weight Margaret hadn't heard before. "Because I know what it's like to be invisible," Emily said softly. "When I was 16, my mom got sick. Cancer. We didn't have much money, and the medical bills piled up fast. I had to drop out of school to work full-time. I watched people look at us differently. Suddenly, we weren't worth their time. We became a burden, something to avoid. After my mom died, I was alone. I worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. I've slept in my car. I've gone days without eating. I've been where you are. And I swore that if I ever got back on my feet, I would never walk past someone in need. I would never look away." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, real ones this time. She reached out and held Emily's hand. "You're a rare soul," Margaret whispered. "Don't ever lose that." Emily smiled, squeezed her hand, and said, "I won't." As Emily walked away that evening, Margaret sat there, heart pounding. She had found her, the woman her son needed. But now came the hardest part. How would she reveal the truth? And more importantly, would Emily forgive her for the deception? Margaret waited 2 more days. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, she approached Emily outside the bakery, this time dressed in her normal clothes, clean and dignified. Emily was locking up after her shift when she saw the older woman walking toward her. Her eyes widened in shock. "Wait, you're—" Emily stammered, unable to finish. Margaret nodded slowly. "My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm not homeless. I never was." Emily's face went pale. She took a step back, confusion and hurt flashing across her face. "I don't understand. Why would you lie?" "I wasn't lying about needing help," Margaret said gently. "I was trying to find something much more important. I was looking for kindness. Real kindness. The kind that doesn't ask for anything in return." Emily crossed her arms, still guarded. "And why would you need to do that?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Because my son has given up on love, and I refuse to let him live the rest of his life alone." She explained everything. David's heartbreak, his walls, his refusal to trust anyone, and how Margaret had spent weeks observing young women in town, searching for someone whose heart was pure. "You passed every test, Emily," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Not because you knew you were being tested, but because you didn't. You gave everything without expecting anything. And that's the kind of woman my son needs." Emily stood there, silent, processing everything. Then she asked the question Margaret had been dreading. "Does he even know about this?" Margaret shook her head. "No, and I won't tell him unless you agree to meet him." "Emily, I'm not asking you to fall in love with him. I'm asking you to give him a chance." To sit down, have a conversation, and see if there's something real between you two. If there's nothing, I'll accept that. But if there is, Emily bit her lip, looking down. I don't know. This feels so strange. I understand, Margaret said. But sometimes the best things come from the most unlikely beginnings. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up. Okay, I'll meet him. Margaret exhaled in relief, a smile breaking across her face. Thank you. 2 days later, Margaret invited David to lunch at a small cafe downtown. She told him she wanted him to meet someone, a friend who needed advice about starting a business. David was hesitant but agreed. When he walked into the cafe, he saw his mother sitting at a table with a young woman. The moment his eyes met Emily's, something shifted. He didn't know why, but he felt an odd pull, a quiet recognition, as if he'd been searching for her without knowing it. Margaret introduced them, carefully, naturally. They talked for over 2 hours. About work, about dreams, about loss. David found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years. Emily listened, asked questions, and shared pieces of her own story. There was no pretense, no performance, just two people connecting. As they left the cafe, David turned to his mother and said, "Can I see her again?" Margaret's heart soared. "Yes, sweetheart. I think you should." Over the next few months, David and Emily grew closer. They went on quiet walks, shared late-night phone calls, talked about their pasts, their fears, their hopes. David began to trust again, slowly, carefully. He told Emily about Jessica, about the pain that had closed him off. Emily listened without judgment. She told him about her mother, about the years she spent struggling, about learning to find joy even in hardship. They fit together in a way that felt effortless. But there was one secret still hanging between them, and Margaret knew it couldn't stay hidden forever. One evening, 6 months into their relationship, Margaret invited both of them over for dinner. After the meal, as they sat in the living room, Margaret cleared her throat. "There's something I need to tell you both." David and Emily looked at her, confused. Margaret turned to David first. "Do you remember when I told you I had a friend who needed business advice? That's not entirely true." Then she turned to Emily. "And Emily, there's something about how we really met that I need to explain." Over the next 30 minutes, Margaret told them everything. The disguise, the test, the weeks spent on the street, the reasons behind it all. David stared at his mother in disbelief. "Mom, you did what?" Emily sat quietly, her expression unreadable. David turned to her. "Did you know about this?" "Not at first," Emily said softly. "Your mom told me before we met. I almost didn't agree to it. But I did, because I wanted to meet you." David stood up, pacing. "This is insane. You both lied to me." "I didn't lie about my feelings," Emily said, standing as well. "Everything between us has been real. Every conversation, every moment. That was me. Not a test. Me." David looked between his mother and Emily, torn between anger and something else he couldn't name. "You manipulated this," he said to Margaret. "You manipulated me." "I did," Margaret admitted, tears in her eyes. "And I'm sorry, but I couldn't watch you waste your life because one person broke your heart. You deserve love, David. Real love. And I found it for you." David shook his head. "That's not your choice to make." "You're right," Margaret whispered. "It's yours." The room went silent. Emily stepped closer to David. "If you want me to leave, I will," she said quietly. "I won't fight it. But I need you to know something. I didn't fall in love with you because your mother set this up. I fell in love with you because of who you are. The way you listen. The way you care. The way you've rebuilt yourself even when you didn't think you could. That's real. And if you can't see that, then maybe I was wrong." David looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past his walls. He saw the woman who had shown up, who had been patient, who had loved him without conditions. Slowly, he reached for her hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm scared." "I know," Emily said, squeezing his hand. "So am I. But I'm still here." David turned to his mother. "I'm angry, but I also understand why you did it." Margaret nodded, her heart full. "That's all I ask." Months passed. The anger faded. Trust deepened. David and Emily built something solid, something real. They moved in together. They talked about the future without fear. And one quiet evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's breath caught. "I never thought I'd do this again," David said, his voice steady. "But you showed me that love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. It's about seeing someone and choosing them anyway. He opened the box. Will you marry me? Emily's tears came fast. Yes. They were married 6 months later in Margaret's backyard, surrounded by close friends and family. As Margaret watched her son exchange vows with the woman who had passed a test she never knew she was taking, she felt a peace she hadn't felt in years. After the ceremony, Emily approached Margaret, pulling her into a tight hug. Thank you, Emily whispered, for seeing me. Margaret held her close, tears streaming down her face. No, sweetheart. Thank you for proving that kindness still exists in this world. As the evening went on, and the celebration filled the air, Margaret stood off to the side, watching David and Emily dance. She thought about the weeks she'd spent on that cold sidewalk, the people who had ignored her, the one who hadn't, and she realized something profound. Sometimes love doesn't find us in the places we expect. Sometimes it finds us in the moments we're brave enough to look beyond ourselves. Emily had done that, and in return, she'd found something priceless. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What would you have done if you were Margaret? Would you have taken that risk? Would you have sat on a cold street corner, pretending to be someone you weren't, just to find the right person for someone you love? Or do you think some things should be left to fate? And if you were Emily, and you found out later that your first meetings with the man you loved were orchestrated by his mother, would you have stayed? Would you have seen the love behind the test? Or would you have walked away? Think about it. Because somewhere in your life, someone is watching. Someone is testing you without you knowing. Not to trick you, but to see who you really are when no one is keeping score. And the truth is, we're all being tested every single day. By how we treat the person who serves us coffee. By how we respond to the stranger who asks for help. By the kindness we show when there's nothing to gain. Margaret didn't just find a wife for her son. She reminded all of us what really matters. Not wealth, not status, not the image we project, but the heart we carry when no one's watching. Emily passed that test, and in doing so, she didn't just win David's love. She restored his faith. What about you? Who have you walked past today? Who have you ignored? Who have you dismissed because they couldn't offer you anything in return? Maybe it's time we all start passing the test. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Would you have done what Margaret did? Would you have trusted a test like this? Or do you believe love should happen naturally without interference? We want to hear your thoughts. Your perspective might inspire someone else watching. And if you stayed with us all the way to the end, thank you. That means something. It means you value stories that go deeper than the surface, that you care about the lessons hidden in everyday moments. There are more stories like this waiting for you. Stories about love, sacrifice, courage, and the beautiful, messy truth of being human. So hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because next time, we have a story even more powerful than this one. A story about a father who walked away from everything to save his daughter. And what he discovered along the way will leave you speechless. Until then, take care of each other. Show kindness. And remember, the smallest gesture can change someone's entire life. You never know who's watching. You never know who's being tested. But more importantly, you never know who you might save just by seeing them.